The biting wind whipped thin strands of hair across her face, stinging her eyes, but the chill she felt ran deeper, colder than the November air. Another rent reminder tacked crudely to the door, another week stretching ahead like a barren wasteland, demanding more than her meager earnings could possibly offer. Hunger was a constant companion, a gnawing void she tried to ignore with every forced smile. This wasn't living. This was merely enduring, a shadow existence, haunted by the ghosts of unpaid bills and deferred dreams. She carried the weight of a difficult past, a childhood marked by scarcity and uncertainty, yet somewhere, deep inside, a tiny ember of hope refused to be extinguished. It flickered with the image of a life unburdened, a future where she wasn't just surviving, but thriving, seen, valued, finally stepping out of the shadows. But right now, the path ahead seemed impossibly steep, shrouded in the persistent fog of hardship. Can one person truly overcome such overwhelming odds? Can light pierce through such deep, entrenched darkness? Witness the strength forged in fire, the quiet resilience that refuses to break. If her journey resonates, let us know by liking this video and subscribing for more stories of struggle and ultimate triumph. From the moment she could remember, life had been a tightrope walk over a chasm of debt and despair. Growing up meant hand-me-down shoes with holes in the soles that let in the biting winter slush, the metallic tang of cheap canned food, and the ever-present hum of a worn-out refrigerator that seemed to mourn alongside them. There were no lullabies, only the anxious whispers about making ends meet, the scent of stale cigarettes, and desperation clinging to the air like a second skin. Yet even then, tucked away in dusty corners, with library books borrowed against the rules, she dreamed. She dreamed of quiet rooms filled with sunshine, of shelves stocked with food, of a job where her voice mattered and her effort was seen. These dreams were fragile things, often crushed under the heavy boot of reality, but they persisted, a secret fuel in the engine of her young spirit. Now, reality was the relentless fluorescent glare of the call center, the constant low murmur of dozens of strained conversations, the faint, metallic smell of cheap disinfectant that never quite masked the underlying odor of stale coffee and desperation. It was here, answering endless calls from frustrated strangers for minimum wage, that the feeling of being overlooked solidified into a painful certainty. Every day was a performance of cheerful competence she didn't feel, her own needs and aspirations invisible beneath the weight of customer complaints and corporate scripts. Supervisors rarely made eye contact, their praise reserved for those who hit unattainable metrics, their criticism quick and sharp for any perceived lapse. She was just a number, a voice on the other end of a line, easily replaced, utterly undervalued. In this sterile, impersonal world, she felt smaller than ever, the classic underdog in a fight she hadn't chosen, struggling to find her footing on slippery ground. The fluorescent lights hummed a dull, ceaseless tune above. Another morning bled into afternoon, indistinguishable from the last, a monotonous cycle of chipped countertops and the faint, persistent smell of cleaning solution and stale coffee. Her feet ached inside worn-out shoes, a constant dull throb that mirrored the weariness in her soul. Every day brought the same parade of faces, a fleeting glimpse into lives so starkly different from her own, a constant, grinding reminder of the chasm that separated their world from hers. Some customers were polite, a brief nod, a quiet thank you. But they were rare islands in a sea of casual indifference. Most treated her less like a person and more like an extension of the automated payment system. Their eyes would slide past her face, focusing instead on the transaction. Their voices clipped, impatient, as if acknowledging her existence was an unnecessary burden. There was the sharp, dismissive tone of the woman, who barely met her gaze while handing over a crumpled $20 bill.
Keep the change,
The woman had said, though the amount was negligible. Not generosity, but a hurried dismissal, a clear message that her time was more valuable than polite interaction or a few coins. Then there was the businessman, phone pressed to his ear, gesturing impatiently for her to hurry. He spoke loudly, oblivious or uncaring of the fact that he was having a private conversation in a public space. His words laced with authority she could only dream of possessing. He didn't even look at her when she placed his items in the bag.
just put it in there.
He barked into the phone, his voice carrying the weight of someone used to being instantly obeyed. He snatched the bag without a word, the rustle of expensive fabric a stark contrast to her simple, worn uniform. This was the norm. This was the daily bread. A constant stream of small humiliations, tiny pinpricks of disrespect that accumulated like dust on a forgotten shelf. It wasn't overt malice, often, but a pervasive sense of being invisible, of her humanity being less important than the convenience of the transaction. The class divide wasn't just visible in their clothes or cars, it was palpable in the air, in the way they spoke or didn't speak to her. She felt the sting of it, the quiet frustration building inside her, a pressure cooker simmering beneath the surface of her practiced, weary smile. Each dismissive word, each averted gaze, each instance of entitlement chipped away at her spirit, adding another layer to the heavy cloak of anonymity she wore in this place. She longed for something, anything, to break the relentless cycle. She couldn't know that the break was coming, not in the quiet resignation she expected, but in a confrontation that would shatter the mundane routine and force the world, for just a moment, to see her. It was an encounter she couldn't predict, a collision course set in motion by the very forces of casual cruelty she faced each day. The fluorescent office lights hummed, a monotonous, oppressive sound that seemed to vibrate in her very bones. Maria clutched her worn leather handbag, its familiar scent of old paper and mints, a small comfort in the sterile air. Tucked inside, beneath a half-eaten granola bar and a crumpled tissue, was a small, significant sum of money. It represented weeks, months of careful saving, penny by penny, sacrifice after sacrifice. It was for the advanced certification course in project management she desperately wanted to take. That course wasn't just about a promotion or a raise. It was a lifeline. It was the promise of a better job, one where perhaps she wouldn't feel this constant, gnawing fear. It was a chance to finally afford that small, safe apartment for her aging mother, to stop worrying about the leaky roof back home, to give her younger sister the tutor she needed. Every extra shift, every skipped lunch, every worn-out pair of shoes was a step closer to that goal, a tangible piece of hope she clung to like a drowning swimmer grasping driftwood. But here, in this office, under the cold glare of those who seemed determined to break her, that hope felt terrifyingly fragile. It was like holding a delicate glass bird in a hurricane. The whispers followed her, sharp as shards of ice, chilling her skin despite the stuffy office air. The casual cruelty, the constant undermining of her work, each instance chipped away at her confidence, making her question if she could even hold on to this job. let alone strive for something more. Her stomach twisted into a knot of anxiety. Losing this job didn't just mean a temporary setback. It meant the glass bird would shatter. The savings would evaporate just to survive. The course would become an impossible dream, and the vulnerability of her family would remain exposed. The pressure was immense, a crushing weight on her chest that made each breath shallow and difficult. She had to keep her head down. She had to ignore the stares, the snickers that followed her down the hallway, the deliberate obstacles placed in her path. Her future, her family's well-being, depended entirely on her ability to swallow the humiliation, plaster a neutral expression on her face, and simply survive each agonizing day. The glint of hope, once so bright, now flickered weakly, threatened by the gathering storm. The bell above the door chimed, a sound usually associated with cheerful arrivals, but this time it felt like a gong announcing doom. Every head in the small, worn establishment turned simultaneously, and a collective gasp, quiet but palpable, rippled through the room. Standing framed in the doorway was a woman who seemed less like a customer and more like a force of nature, albeit a perfectly sculpted, highly expensive one. Her coat, a shimmering cascade of silk in a deep emerald hue, looked as if it cost more than the entire year's rent for the building. Diamonds glittered at her throat and wrists, catching the weak afternoon light and refracting it into blinding shards that seemed to mock the chipped paint and faded decor. Her face, meticulously made up, held an expression of disdain, as if the very air she was breathing was beneath her. She didn't walk in so much as glide, her posture radiating an untouchable arrogance that pushed against the room like a physical wave. A heavy, cloying perfume, overpoweringly sweet and undeniably expensive, filled the air, masking the familiar, comforting sense of the place. The warmth that had permeated the shop moments before evaporated, replaced by a sudden, chilling tension. The low murmur of conversation died entirely. Even the rhythmic hum of the old refrigerator seemed to quiet down, as if intimidated. Every eye followed her as she surveyed the room, her gaze sweeping over the humble surroundings and the faces of the other patrons with undisguised contempt. It was the look of someone accustomed to having the world bow at their feet and finding the current lack of genuflection utterly unacceptable. Then her cold, assessing eyes landed on Maria, who stood frozen behind the counter, a damp rag forgotten in her hand. A familiar knot tightened in Maria's stomach, cold dread coiling deep within her. This woman wasn't just wealthy. She carried an aura of entitled cruelty, a power that seemed to relish making others feel small and insignificant. Her very presence was an invasion, disrupting the fragile peace Maria had fought so hard to maintain in her little corner of the world. It wasn't just the shift in atmosphere, it was the suffocating certainty that trouble, sharp and unavoidable, had just walked through the door, and it was looking directly at her. The dramatic tension in the room wasn't just because of her wealth. It was the unspoken promise of conflict her arrival delivered. The air in the hushed, elegant space seemed to thicken as the large oak door swung inward, admitting a figure cloaked in an aura of indisputable wealth. Mr. Albright, known more for his sprawling estate and imposing presence than any particular warmth, surveyed the room with eyes that held a perpetual glint of dissatisfaction. He approached the counter where Ilara stood, her smile practiced but genuine, ready to assist. A faint, expensive scent of cedarwood and something citrusy preceded him, a tangible marker of his different world.
I am here for the item I commissioned.
His voice was low, resonant, but lacked any pleasant inflection. It was the sound of a man accustomed to being instantly obeyed. Ilara nodded, pulling up the details on the screen. The glow of the monitor reflected faintly in her kind eyes.
Mr. Albright. Yes, the sculpture. It's just being given its final polish. It will be ready for viewing in just a moment.
She gestured towards a back room, her movements calm and professional. The smooth surface of the counter felt cool under her fingertips, a small anchor in the rising tension she suddenly felt. A sharp, almost imperceptible shift occurred in his demeanor. His shoulders stiffened, and the slight curve of his lips flattened into a hard line. The initial subtle dismissiveness in his tone sharpened, like a blade honed to a finer edge.
A moment? I was told it would be ready now. I don't have moments to spare, young woman. My time is considerably more valuable than yours.
The casual cruelty of the statement hung in the air, heavy and cold. Ilara's stomach clenched. It was a minor delay, perhaps 5 minutes at most, part of the meticulous process they followed. But his reaction was immediate, disproportionate.
I apologize for the slight delay, sir. Our artisan is simply ensuring perfection. It's a piece of significant detail.
She tried to placate, her voice gentle, despite the prickle of defensiveness that rose within her. He scoffed, a harsh, grating sound.
Perfection? Or incompetence? I commissioned the finest work and expect punctuality to match. Do you understand the level of clientele you are dealing with here?
His gaze swept over her, cold and condescending, making her feel suddenly small and insignificant in the grand room. The air grew colder, charged with his building irritation. It was no longer just about the sculpture. It was about asserting his dominance, his perceived superiority over her and the establishment. The initial tremor of conflict had begun, subtle in its origin, but rapidly escalating under the weight of his outsized sense of entitlement. The air in the bustling cafe, moments before filled with the murmur of conversations and the clatter of ceramic cups, suddenly fractured. It began with a sharp, cutting voice, louder than necessary, drawing heads away from pastries and screens. The woman who had been the subject of the protagonist's quiet observation just moments ago was now a whirlwind of manufactured fury, her face contorted into a mask of disdain. She hadn't just spoken, she had attacked. Accusations flew, baseless and venomous, aimed squarely at the young woman who stood behind the counter, frozen in disbelief. It wasn't just about the coffee, it was about her. The customer's words twisted the simple transaction into something dirty, something incompetent, something born of inferiority.
Honestly, you people can't even get a simple order right? It's always something, isn't it? Like you don't belong here handling anything decent.
The phrase "you people" hung heavy in the air, dripping with condescension and a blatant disregard for dignity, clearly aimed at the protagonist's humble origins. Perhaps her accent, her clothes, some unseen marker of perceived lower status. It was a jab designed to wound, to diminish, to make her feel small and insignificant, not just in this moment, but inherently. The noise amplified. The customer didn't want a quiet resolution. She wanted a spectacle. She gestured wildly, pointing fingers, her voice rising to a near shriek.
Look at this! Everyone, look! She's clearly not trained. Probably shouldn't even be working here. What kind of establishment hires this?
Her words were laced with an arrogant entitlement, an assumption that her wealth or status gave her the right to tear someone down in public. Heads turned. Conversations ceased. A suffocating circle of curious, judgmental, and perhaps sympathetic eyes began to form. The warm aroma of roasted coffee beans that usually comforted the protagonist now felt alien, oppressive. The gentle hum of the espresso machine seemed to mock the sudden harsh silence. The protagonist's cheeks burned, a fire that started deep inside her chest and spread upwards, fueled by shame and a burning, helpless anger. Her hands, which moments ago had been expertly steaming milk, trembled visibly.
Ma'am, I assure you, I made it exactly as you asked.
Her voice was barely a whisper, tight with rising panic, the words catching in her throat like shards of glass. The sheer injustice of it, the sudden, unprovoked malice, stole her breath. This wasn't a simple customer complaint. It was a public execution of her confidence, her worth, her very right to stand there and earn a living. The scrutiny felt physical, like 1,000 tiny needles pricking her skin. Every eye felt like a judgment. Every hushed whisper, a confirmation of the cruel words being thrown at her. Humiliation washed over her in suffocating waves, thick and heavy as a shroud. She felt exposed, vulnerable, utterly alone in the harsh glare of public attention. The world suddenly shrinking to this single, agonizing point of conflict. This was the core, the brutal heart of the matter. Not a simple mistake, but a deliberate, public act of shaming designed to grind her spirit into dust. The man, slicked back hair and a sneer etched onto his lips, leaned closer, his voice dropping to a condescending whisper that somehow carried across the hushed space. His tailored suit seemed to hum with arrogance, a stark contrast to the worn fabric of her uniform. He gestured vaguely towards the item she had presented, his eyes cold and dismissive. This wasn't just a complaint. It was an assault on her very being, delivered with surgical precision.
Honestly, do you people even understand quality? This looks like it was handled by someone who, well, let's just say they're not used to things of value. Perhaps stick to what you know.
The words landed like physical blows. You people. The dismissive wave. Stick to what you know, implying her world was inherently inferior, incapable of grasping value beyond her own station. A hot flush spread across her cheeks, a fire of humiliation that threatened to consume her. Her breath hitched in her throat, a sudden sharp intake of air, as if she'd been punched. The polished floor beneath her feet suddenly felt unstable. She could feel the eyes of a few lingering customers, drawn by the man's booming confidence and her visible discomfort. The air grew thick, suffocating, laden with the heavy scent of his expensive cologne and the bitter tang of her rising shame. He wasn't just criticizing the service or the product. He was dismantling her, piece by piece, with every loaded word. He called her attention to detail amateurish, her understanding of the product pathetic, and suggested her entire presence here was a mistake, that she was fundamentally ill-equipped for this environment.
Frankly, you're wasting my time. Some people simply don't have the capacity for this level of service. It's not your fault, I suppose. Just unfortunate.
Unfortunate. The word dripped with false pity, a final, cutting insult wrapped in a veneer of magnanimity. It stripped away not just her competence, but her dignity. It reduced her to an inconvenience, a lesser being, incapable of rising to his arbitrary standards. Her hands, clasped tightly behind her back, trembled. She felt a profound urge to lash out, to tell him exactly what she thought of his entitled cruelty. but a lifetime of ingrained restraint, of knowing her place in the system, held her frozen. Inside, a storm raged. Waves of embarrassment crashed against the rocky shores of her pride. How dare he speak to her like that? How dare he make her feel so small, so worthless, for simply doing her job? The feeling of being stripped naked, exposed under the harsh fluorescent lights, was almost unbearable. Yet outwardly, she remained still, a statue carved from wounded pride and desperate composure. Her jaw clenched, a muscle twitching slightly near her temple. She focused on a point just above his shoulder, refusing to let him see the full devastation his words had wrought. The sting was deep, a venom spreading through her veins, but she would not let it paralyze her. Not here, not now. She had to stand tall, even as her knees felt ready to buckle. The cruelty of his words fueled a quiet, simmering anger, a silent promise that this moment, this searing humiliation, would not be forgotten. It was a heavy burden to carry, but for now, she bore it, focusing every ounce of will on keeping her composure intact. The world tilted, not violently, but with a sickening slow lurch. Maria stood rooted to the spot, the sharp, metallic taste of fear coating her tongue. The air, moments ago thick with the tension of the incident, had gone unnaturally still, save for a low hum of confused whispers that seemed to vibrate in her very bones. Every eye in the vicinity felt like a burning coal pressed against her skin. She could feel the weight of their judgment. The sudden shift from colleagues or passersby to a silent, scrutinizing jury. Her hands trembled, not just a slight tremor, but a violent, uncontrollable shaking that she desperately tried to hide by clasping them together, fingers digging into palms. A knot tightened in her stomach, a cold, hard ball of dread and helplessness. The vivid colors of the room blurred at the edges of her vision, replaced by a gray haze of shock. She felt small, exposed, stripped bare under this relentless public gaze. It was worse than any physical blow. This was an assault on her spirit, leaving her utterly vulnerable. She wanted the floor to swallow her whole, to disappear from the hushed accusations and the pitying stares alike. A single tear traced a hot path down her cheek, quickly followed by another, blurring her sight further. The soft scent of cleaning supplies that usually lingered in the air was now overpowered by the acrid smell of her own fear. Then a figure detached itself from the periphery. It was Mr. Harrison, the floor manager, his expression a tight mask of professional concern mixed with something unreadable. He moved towards her, his footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the silence. He reached her side, his voice low, but amplified by the sudden focus on his intervention.
Maria, let's step into my office. We need to discuss this.
His words were measured, formal, offering no comfort, no protection, only the stark reality of consequence and process. They cut through the days, confirming the undeniable truth. The damage was done. The incident, whatever it was, had happened. It was witnessed, and it was now an official problem. Stepping away with him felt less like being rescued and more like being escorted to judgment. Her legs felt heavy, disconnected from her body. Moving required immense effort. Each step, a testament to the crushing weight of the moment. Vulnerability washed over her in waves, a cold, engulfing tide. She was adrift in a sea of helplessness, with no paddle and no shore in sight. The watchful eyes followed her until the office door closed behind them, sealing her in with the consequences, leaving her feeling utterly alone with the pieces of her shattered peace. The antiseptic scent of the small office clung to the air, thick and suffocating, a stark contrast to the chaos that had erupted just hours before. Maria sat across the polished desk, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a desperate bird trapped in a cage. She watched the manager, a man usually defined by his brisk efficiency, now seemingly struggling to find the right words. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken dread. Then the words came, tumbling out like cold stones dropped into a still pond, shattering the fragile calm she had desperately tried to maintain. It was swift, clinical, delivered with a forced empathy that felt more like pity. Due to the severity of the customer complaint, the damaging nature of the video circulating online, and the perceived negative impact on the brand's image, her employment was being terminated, effective immediately. The air seemed to vanish from the room. Maria gasped, a raw, choked sound that barely escaped her lips. Termination. The word echoed in the sudden void, stripping away her stability, her future, everything she had worked so hard for. She felt a dizzying wave wash over her, the crisp edges of the office blurring through unshed tears. This wasn't just a job. It was her lifeline, the foundation she was building her dreams upon. The rent that was due, the student loan payments, the small savings she was accumulating for a better future. They all dissolved in that one brutal sentence. A wave of profound unfairness crashed down upon her. She was the one who had been publicly humiliated, screamed at, and falsely accused. She was the one whose face was now plastered across screens, a target for strangers' judgment and scorn. And yet, she was the one being punished. The customer who had initiated the entire horrifying scene with their venomous lie faced no consequence here. The world, in that moment, felt twisted and cruel, a place where the victim was penalized while the aggressor walked away unscathed. The manager continued speaking, offering platitudes about severance and references, but his voice sounded distant, muffled, as if coming from the end of a long tunnel. Maria could barely process the words, her mind fixated on the image of that customer's sneering face, the glint of malice in their eyes as they wielded their phone like a weapon. Their actions, their calculated cruelty, had directly led to this moment, to the cold knot of despair tightening in her stomach, to the utter devastation she felt. This was the consequence. This was the rock bottom. Losing the job wasn't just about losing an income. It was about losing her sense of safety, her belief in fairness, and the fragile hope she had been nurturing for a brighter tomorrow. The weight of it was crushing, stealing her breath, leaving her adrift in a sudden, terrifying uncertainty. She felt a deep, aching loneliness settle in her bones, the bitter taste of injustice thick on her tongue. The world outside had continued turning, indifferent and bright. But for her, the days that followed the shattering incident were swathed in an impenetrable gray. The sharp, clean break of the dismissal felt less like an ending and more like falling into a deep, lightless well. She didn't mark the hours, only the sluggish creep of time measured by the growing dust motes dancing in the thin shafts of light that pierced the drawn blinds. The taste in her mouth was perpetually flat, like cardboard, a physical echo of the desolation that had settled deep within her bones. Each morning was a cruel jolt, a fresh confrontation with the stark reality of her situation. The official papers lay on the table, their crisp edges a stark contrast to the crumbling state of her resolve. The words blurred, but the finality of her job loss, her sudden, abrupt professional non-existence, was a cold, hard stone in her gut. Sleep offered little respite. Fractured dreams offered fleeting moments of normalcy before dissolving into the suffocating dread of waking. A profound weariness seeped into her muscles, making even simple tasks feel monumentally difficult. Getting out of bed required an act of will she wasn't sure she possessed. She found herself staring for long stretches at nothing, the silence of the apartment amplifying the frantic, questioning whispers in her own mind. Was it all her fault? The accusations, the betrayals, they replayed like a broken record, each note twisting tighter the knot of self-doubt. The foundation of her confidence, built painstakingly over years of hard work and dedication, had been obliterated in an instant. If they could just discard her, if her contribution meant so little in the face of malice, what did that say about her worth? The once familiar walls of her home felt alien, pressing in on her, trapping her in a cage of her own making. Or perhaps a cage others had so expertly constructed around her. This wasn't just a setback. This felt like hitting rock bottom with brutal force. There was no upward trajectory, no next step visible in the dense fog that surrounded her. The future, once a landscape of possibilities, now loomed as a vast, terrifying void filled with uncertainty. How would she rebuild? Could she even face the world again? The smell of stale air hung heavy, mirroring the stagnation she felt within. The touch of the cool floor beneath her bare feet was a chilling reminder of how exposed and vulnerable she felt, adrift in a sea of consequence, not entirely of her own making, yet bearing its full, crushing weight. Despair wasn't a fleeting emotion. It was a physical presence, a heavy shroud wrapped around her, chilling her to the core. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of damp leaves and distant city exhaust. He stood slightly apart from the flowing current of people, a figure both present and detached. His coat, though simple in cut, possessed an undeniable quality that spoke of tailoring and expense, lost on the preoccupied crowd hurrying past. He wasn't looking at his phone, or checking the time, or waiting for anyone in particular, or so it seemed. His gaze drifted, observing the everyday theater of the street, a world away from the polished boardrooms and private jets that constituted his usual sphere. Then his attention snagged. Across the square, near the entrance to a quiet side street, a young woman stood. Her shoulders were slightly slumped, but her posture held a fragile dignity. He couldn't hear her words, but he saw her face, etched with a profound weariness, and the subtle, almost imperceptible clench of her jaw. She wasn't crying openly, wasn't causing a scene. She was simply enduring. He saw someone else nearby, a man whose back was to the stranger, gesturing dismissively, an air of impatience radiating from him even at that distance. The man turned. A brief, sharp word seemed to pass between them, and then the man walked away, melting into the throng, leaving the woman alone. The stranger watched her for a moment longer. She didn't chase after him, didn't shout, didn't even visibly react beyond that tightening in her jaw. She simply stood there, a small, still point in the bustling energy of the city, hugging a worn leather bag closer to her side. The afternoon sun caught a single tear tracking a path down her cheek, quickly brushed away with a determined hand. It wasn't the tear that held his gaze, but the almost immediate erasure of it, the refusal to surrender completely to the visible pain. There was a quiet strength there, a deep well of resilience that resonated with something he rarely saw in his own world of carefully constructed facades. Most people, faced with such overt disregard, would collapse or explode. She did neither. She simply gathered herself, took a deep, shuddering breath that seemed to pull strength from the very air, and slowly, deliberately, began to walk away in the opposite direction. He didn't know her story, didn't know the nature of the exchange he just witnessed the tail end of. But in that fleeting moment, he saw something unique in her quiet resolve. It wasn't defeat in her eyes, but a hardened, quiet purpose. He made no move to approach, simply watching until she disappeared around the corner. A fleeting image of quiet endurance against the indifferent backdrop of the city. The air suddenly felt a little colder. The damp chill of the concrete seeped through the thin soles of her worn shoes, a biting reminder of her exposed state. She huddled deeper into her threadbare coat, the smell of exhaust fumes and damp earth clinging to the fabric. Across the bustling street, a man stood, seemingly waiting, yet his gaze wasn't fixed on traffic or the distant horizon. It rested, subtly, on her. She hadn't noticed him before, lost in the swirling vortex of her own humiliation and despair. The world had felt like a cruel, indifferent machine, grinding her down piece by piece. But then a sudden gust of wind, sharp and cold, ripped through the narrow alleyway where she sought refuge. It tore a handful of tattered papers from her grasp, the last remnants of a hopeful application, now worthless and scattered across the grime-slicked pavement. A wave of fresh agony washed over her. It felt like the universe was mocking her final, futile efforts. Her shoulders slumped further, a silent sob catching in her throat. The world pressed in, heavy and suffocating. She knelt slowly, joints protesting, the cold biting her knees through her thin trousers. Her fingers, numb and clumsy, fumbled with the damp paper scraps. They were ruined, stained with mud and oil, the ink bleeding into illegible blots. It was hopeless. Tears, hot and stinging, finally spilled onto her cold cheeks, mixing with the grit on her skin. She didn't look up, didn't care who might see her brokenness. Yet, through the haze of her tears, she saw a shadow fall over the papers. A pair of polished shoes stood before her, a stark contrast to her own battered footwear. She flinched, expecting a dismissive glance or perhaps a harsh word telling her to move along. Instead, a hand steady and clean reached down not to offer money or help, but to gently push a single, less soiled piece of paper back towards her. She finally lifted her gaze, meeting the eyes of the stranger from across the street. They weren't filled with pity nor judgment, but a quiet, almost analytical observation. He didn't say a word about her plight, the scattered papers, or her tears. His eyes simply lingered on the way she clutched the single paper fragment he had nudged towards her, not with desperation, but with a strange, quiet dignity, as if holding on to a last ember of hope in the face of overwhelming darkness. It was a small thing, the simple gesture with the paper, the silent acknowledgement of her presence without intrusion. But in that moment, a seed of something unexpected was planted. The stranger hadn't offered salvation, merely noticed the unwavering spark of resilience hidden beneath the layers of her suffering. He saw not just the victim, but the quiet strength of a spirit refusing to be completely extinguished, even as she knelt broken on the cold ground. This single, non-transactional interaction, so brief and understated, marked an unseen turning point, a subtle shift in the cosmic balance she couldn't yet comprehend. The air in the room, already thick with tension, became impossibly still as the stranger offered a calm, almost knowing smile. He didn't posture or raise his voice. The weight of his words came solely from their meaning.
My name is Elias Thorne.
The name hung in the silence like a sudden drop in temperature. A collective gasp seemed to ripple through the room, quickly stifled by sheer disbelief. Elias Thorne. The name wasn't just a name, it was the name. It belonged to a figure whose face graced magazine covers, whose companies spanned continents, a titan of industry whose net worth dwarfed empires. Jaws literally went slack. Eyes bulged, scanning the unassuming man before them, searching for some sign of fraud. Some tell that this was a cruel, elaborate joke. The opulent suit now seemed less like the attire of a well-dressed observer and more like the understated uniform of impossible wealth. A shiver, cold and profound, traced its way down spines. The bully's smirks vanished, replaced by a ghastly pallor. The cocky swagger drained from their stances, leaving them looking small and suddenly very, very vulnerable. They had been mocking, harassing, and dismissing Elias Thorne. The realization hit them with the force of a physical blow, stealing the breath from their lungs. It felt like the floor had dropped out from under the world they knew. The protagonist, too, stood frozen, a whirlwind of confusion and shock roaring in their ears. Elias Thorne? Here? Why? How could someone of his stature possibly be involved in their small, insignificant struggle? The unfairness they had endured, the pain they had felt, seemed minuscule, almost laughable, in the face of this impossible revelation. It was like finding a grain of sand in a hurricane. Yet somehow, the hurricane was here because of the sand. Thorne observed their stunned faces, a hint of empathy softening his gaze. He didn't crave the drama. He sought justice.
I understand your surprise. To explain, I have interests in ensuring ethical conduct within certain industries. My team monitors activities that raise red flags. Your situation, your courage in the face of such blatant abuse, came to my attention some weeks ago.
He spoke of digital trails, of internal reports dismissed, of a pattern of behavior that couldn't be ignored. He hadn't simply stumbled upon the scene. He had been watching, quietly gathering information, waiting for the right moment to intervene. He described how the protagonist's case was highlighted, a clear example of systemic failure and personal cruelty that resonated deeply. The explanation, delivered without fanfare, only amplified the astonishment. He hadn't just heard about it. He had known. He had chosen to be here. The gravity of his presence, now understood, crushed the previous atmosphere under its weight. The air tasted metallic with fear and a nascent, fragile hope. Elias Thorne was not a random stranger. He was a deliberate presence, a force who had arrived to see justice done. The air in the room thickened, heavy with unspoken consequences and simmering resentment. Every eye was on the man seated at the head of the imposing oak table, a figure of immense wealth and quiet power. He had listened patiently, his gaze steady and assessing as the truth, raw and painful, had unfolded. Now, silence reigned, broken only by the nervous shifting of weight in chairs and the faint hum of the building's HVAC system. It felt like the world held its breath, waiting for judgment. He finally spoke, his voice measured, calm, yet carrying an undeniable weight of authority. It wasn't loud, but it commanded absolute attention, cutting through the tension like a sharp blade. He looked directly at her, at the young woman who had endured so much, her face etched with the exhaustion of a long, brutal fight, but also alight with a flicker of defiant hope.
Ms.
He began, his tone devoid of pity, yet resonating with respect.
What you have faced here is inexcusable. The behavior you have been subjected to reflects the systemic failure that I am committed to correcting.
A chill, sharp and unexpected, ran down her spine. But it wasn't fear. It was the jolt of pure, unadulterated shock. Was this it? Was justice truly arriving?
I have observed your resilience, your integrity, and your unwavering commitment to your goals, even in the face of relentless adversity. I have also learned about your original aspirations, the dreams you held before you were sidetracked by this ordeal.
He paused, leaning forward slightly, his expression one of thoughtful deliberation. He wasn't offering condolences. He was stating facts, acknowledging strength.
What I am about to offer is not an act of charity. It is an investment in demonstrated character and potential, an investment in correcting a profound wrong.
Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She barely dared to breathe. This wasn't the outcome she had mentally prepared for. A simple apology, maybe a small settlement. This felt different, bigger.
I am offering you full sponsorship for your entire degree program at the university of your choice, covering tuition, living expenses, books, everything. Upon graduation, provided you maintain a satisfactory academic record, there will be a guaranteed position waiting for you within my company, in a role commensurate with your qualifications and aspirations, not an entry-level position, but one where you can truly make an impact, far away from the department where you experience this.
The words hung in the air, shimmering with the impossible promise they held. Education, security, a future not just repaired, but potentially brighter than she had ever allowed herself to imagine. Even before the darkness had begun. Her eyes widened, pooling with unshed tears that tasted of sudden, overwhelming relief and a dizzying sense of possibility. The stale office air seemed to vibrate with the magnitude of the moment. The weight of years of struggle and injustice began to lift, replaced by a fragile, breathtaking hope. It was an offer so unbelievable, it felt like a dream she was terrified would shatter upon waking. This was the turning point. The air felt different, lighter, carrying none of the stale weight of her past confines. Stepping across the threshold into the sprawling, sun-drenched atrium of the Foundation's headquarters felt less like entering a building and more like launching into orbit. It was the first literal step into a life she hadn't dared to fully imagine, a life born from the ashes of her ordeal. The sheer scale of the place was staggering. Glass walls soared towards a distant ceiling, reflecting the vibrant greenery of indoor gardens that seemed to breathe life into the concrete structure. It smelled faintly of polished wood and blooming flowers, a stark contrast to the antiseptic chill and desperation that had permeated her recent existence. Her first few days were a dizzying blur of names, faces, and unfamiliar procedures. The learning curve was steep, a sheer cliff face she had to scale with trembling hands and a racing heart. She was assigned a modest but functional office, her own dedicated space, a luxury she had never known. The computer system was complex, the software alien, and the tasks required a level of technical proficiency she simply didn't possess yet. Every interaction felt like navigating a minefield, fearing she would reveal the depth of her ignorance and prove she didn't belong here. She fumbled with the coffee machine, struggled to log into the network, and felt a hot blush creep up her neck when she accidentally printed a document 50 times. Simple things that others did effortlessly became monumental challenges. There were moments of profound doubt, small, insidious whispers in her mind echoing the voices of her tormentors, telling her she was inadequate, that this was too much, too soon, too big for someone like her. The smooth, cool surface of her new desk felt strange beneath her fingertips compared to the rough, worn textures she was used to. The polite, measured tones of her new colleagues were a world away from the sharp, cutting words that had been her daily bread. The feeling of stepping into this unknown world was exhilarating, terrifying, and utterly surreal. It was a vast ocean compared to the stagnant puddle she had been trapped in. The contrast with her previous life was not just stark, it was a chasm. Before, her world had shrunk, defined by limitations and the crushing weight of oppression. Now, it felt infinite, terrifyingly so. The responsibility felt immense, not just to the foundation that had given her this chance, but to herself, to prove that the journey through darkness had led somewhere real, somewhere hopeful. Every small victory, successfully sending an email, understanding a new protocol, completing a task without error, felt like a giant leap. It was the hardest thing she had ever done, this act of simply starting. But with each fumbled attempt and eventual success, a quiet resilience bloomed within her, watered by the knowledge that this fear, this challenge, was the price of freedom, the raw material of her rise. She was an explorer charting unknown territory, armed with little more than determination and the memory of how far she had already come. Years passed, marked not by lingering shadows, but by the quiet accumulation of effort. Maria buried herself in her work, finding solace and purpose in the relentless pursuit of excellence. The echoes of cruel laughter and dismissive words still surfaced in quiet moments, a faint, unpleasant scent, like stale perfume, but they no longer held the power to paralyze. She channeled the pain, the humiliation, the raw vulnerability into fuel. Early mornings were spent hunched over books, the only sound the rustle of pages and the soft tap of her fingers on a keyboard. Late nights blurred into sunrises as she pored over complex problems, the bitter taste of cheap coffee a constant companion. Her focus became absolute, a laser beam cutting through the noise of doubt and fear. Resilience wasn't a sudden gift. It was built brick by painstaking brick, forged in the fires of adversity. Every challenging project she completed, every difficult skill she mastered, added another layer of fortitude to her spirit. She learned to trust her own judgment, to rely on her capabilities, the tactile certainty of competence, replacing the fragile dependence she had once felt on others' approval. She sought out mentors who saw her potential, their encouraging words like cool water on parched earth, nourishing the seeds of ambition. The world outside her relentless grind faded. The opinions of those who had sought to diminish her became irrelevant static in the background. Then came the moments of triumph. Small at first, like distant stars appearing in the twilight. A top grade on a crucial exam, the nod of approval from a respected professor. A competitive internship secured. But they grew brighter, more numerous. She graduated with honors, her name called with distinction. The sound a clean, sharp note in the air, so unlike the whispers that had followed her before. She secured a position at a leading company, not through connections or favoritism, but through sheer merit and undeniable skill. The polished desk felt solid beneath her fingertips, a tangible symbol of her earned place. The greatest validation arrived not with fanfare, but with quiet authority. Her innovative approach to a long-standing industry problem caught the attention of the company's board. One afternoon, the CEO himself, a man whose reputation commanded respect, requested a meeting. The memory of past shaming, the weight of undeserved scorn, flickered for a second, a phantom touch on her shoulder. But she stood taller now, her gaze steady.
Miss Rodriguez, your recent proposal, it's brilliant, truly groundbreaking. You've demonstrated an understanding and a capability that is rare. We're implementing your plan, effective immediately, and we want you to lead the initiative. This is a significant step for the company, and it's thanks to your vision and dedication.
His words were not praise. They were recognition of fact. They resonated not with ego, but with the deep satisfaction of hard work culminating in undeniable success. This was the payback, not making anyone else suffer, but building something so substantial, so undeniably good, that it eclipsed the darkness of the past. Her success was a quiet revolution, a testament to the indomitable power of a spirit that refused to be broken. She had risen, not on the ashes of revenge, but on the solid foundation of her own strength. The weight that had pressed down on her soul for so long wasn't lifted by the first paycheck, nor by the grand office. It was the simple act of being seen, truly seen for her capabilities and character, that began to dissolve the heavy cloak of despair. The journey had never solely been about escaping poverty or seizing a lucrative opportunity. It was a desperate climb back to dignity, a fight to reclaim the potential that others had tried to bury, and a quiet, fierce proving of her own inherent self-worth. She hadn't just earned a living, she had earned back herself. The bitter taste of humiliation, once a constant companion, was slowly replaced by the sweet, subtle flavor of confidence, a nourishment her spirit had craved. Looking back, she understood with painful clarity how fragile a person's self-perception could be when constantly assaulted by the judgment of others, how easily words could cut deeper than any physical blow, convincing someone they were less than, worthless, undeserving. The memory of sneering faces, of doors slammed shut, still held a sting, but now it was tempered by the profound realization of how utterly wrong they had been. It served as a stark, unforgettable moral. Never, ever judge a soul by the rags on their back or the circumstances they currently inhabit. Life's currents could be cruel, pushing the most brilliant people into the darkest corners. It was not poverty that defined a person, but the resilience they showed within it, and the kindness they extended despite it. And conversely, the power of a single opportunity, a hand extended in trust, a belief voiced aloud, held the power to not only change a life, but to restore a spirit. It was a lesson etched onto her heart, a silent vow to always look beyond the surface, to remember the profound impact of both cruelty and compassion. The future stretched ahead, not as a guaranteed paradise, but as a path forged through fire and ice, now illuminated by hard-won clarity. The scars remained, faint lines across the landscape of her past, reminders of the storms weathered and the betrayals endured. They were part of her story now, not symbols of defeat, but etchings of strength. The taste of success was sweeter, knowing the depth of the struggle, the touch of respect more valued, knowing the sting of contempt. The sounds of the bustling world no longer carried the echo of condemnation, but the gentle hum of possibility. She carried the lessons of the past, the pain, yes, but more importantly, the resilience, the unearthed potential, the undeniable proof of her worth. And with each step forward, she carried the quiet certainty that the greatest wealth was not in her bank account, but in the unbreakable spirit finally set free.